Another day in the MMA world, another crazy bit of news. Jake Paul just signed to the PFL. He'll now be working with them to help out the fighters in the PFL and bring a little bit more of a spotlight onto the PFL in general with his big audience that he has. He posted a video on his Instagram and also on his YouTube account breaking down the whole situation, taking some shots at Dana White and the UFC in the process. And he's making big moves. He also said he wants to take on Nate Diaz in a boxing match, and then a rematch afterwards in a 2-fight deal in an MMA match as well. I'm all for it, in all honesty. I am all for this. I think it's about time that someone like Jake Paul and the PFL together put some pressure on the UFC. Because in my opinion, the UFC's been slacking recently. I really do believe they have. And we've got a lot of situations in the UFC right now where if there was another competitor that was really making some big moves and stealing all the spotlights and the headlines and really putting on some big fights and maybe snatching up some people like Paulo Costa and Thiago Santos and putting on some regular big fights in the scene, I feel like the UFC would really buck their ideas up and start sorting out some of these situations with making these big fights and getting out of the apex and not putting on cards like we have with Lewis versus Spivak in a couple of weeks' time that only have 8 fights on a fight night card. We need competition, and Jake Paul is starting to bring that competition to the UFC. He's going after him. He's working like as a higher up in PFL. He's looking to make sure it's like a 50% split of revenue in the PFL going towards the fighters. I don't know how this is going to work out for the PFL business-wise, because you can bring Jake Paul on all you want. Like, the numbers that they do with a lot of the stuff that they have on, like their big grand championship. I know a lot of people paid attention to what happened with that, but I know for a fact the pay-per-view sales for that last PFL tournament for $1 million, it can't have been over 50k. So they're losing money, PFL. But I think the game that they're playing right now is very similar to ONE FC, where they're putting out so much money to get all of the big fighters that they need and bring the spotlight on them because of the amount that they're paying out their fighters, that they're sort of playing a game of how much money can we lose before we start to turn it around and then start to make money 5-10 years in the future and really start to be a bit of competition to the UFC, because they got a bunch of investors. They always have something new that they do at PFL. Like, I think they had Wiz Khalifa involved at one point. I think he still is involved in the PFL as well. And now they got Jake Paul. And I think this is a really good move for them, because if you want to be in competition with the UFC and Dana White, bring in Jake Paul, because he is the guy who wants to go toe-to-toe with the UFC and Dana White, and that's what he's going to try and do. I doubt it'll be too much about Jake Paul. It'll probably be his manager guy that's also going to be part of this deal over to the PFL as well, and he's looking to try and make the fighters more money. So what they're doing is they're trying to be seen as the nice guys in the MMA scene and try and make the UFC look really bad and have all these headlines of all the money that their fighters have been getting paid, and compare that with the UFC lower down fighters and how much they're getting paid. And then maybe they're going to try and sort of like show some of the fighters in the UFC like, hey, if you want to make some money, you can come over to the PFL and get some better money for yourself. Do I think it's going to work in the long run? No, I think the UFC will adjust to this, and I think the UFC will always be the premier MMA brand because they've just got such a massive market right now. Like, you look at their Instagram followers and stuff like that, and just the amount of interactions they get on their posts, you can't compare to the UFC. And also, they've also got that, there's something about being in the UFC. You can be an MMA fighter and you can be one of the best in the world, but you don't seem cool to people unless you say you're a UFC fighter. The UFC almost benefits from the casual MMA audience knowing that it's the UFC, not MMA. And they've done that over the years to make that the way it is. But that's how it is. So if you hear someone's an MMA fighter and they say, oh, wow, you in the UFC? No, I'm in Bellator. No, I'm actually at this thing called the PFL. They'll be like, oh, well, you're not a UFC fighter then. You know what I mean? So the UFC always has that going for them, because typically as a young kid, all of these budding MMA fighters have a big dream of being in the UFC one day. But listen, money talks. And if PFL start paying out some decent money to some of these up-and-comers and some really good money to some other fighters on the roster as well, higher up, they can start convincing people to start joining the PFL instead. And I think that's going to make the UFC start to offer people a little bit more at the entry level to come into the UFC. So I like this because, again, I'm so annoyed by the UFC. And they make a lot of moves, the UFC, and they have been making a lot of moves over the past 5 years or 10 years, which is just, it stinks of, we're going to be the top dogs no matter what, so you'll accept this. You know what I mean? Like when they put a women's main event as the main event of a fight night and put nothing else on the card of any value whatsoever and just poop out the card, knowing that we're going to watch it as UFC fans. Whereas now, maybe with Jake Paul's help and influence and him headlining a card at the PFL against Nate Diaz twice and maybe winning, and then who knows what's next. Mike Perry is also an option. I know he sent Mike Perry a contract as well. But maybe with Jake Paul's name at the head of a PFL card, they can put all of their budding stars and all of their stars in their promotion underneath that card and start to really make something happen in the PFL, because it's a good idea, to be honest with you. I don't like the no elbows. This is why I think the PFL will never take off. They got to make some... I don't like the no elbows. I really don't. And I think the point system thing is a little bit weird, and the tournaments never really work out well, because you always end up with some guy pulling out with an injury because they have to stay so active during the tournament stage, and it never really feels legit. It feels like a bit of like a gimmicky game show of an MMA promotion. But if they can make some adjustments and start fixing those problems in their promotion with the help of Jake Paul, they are going to put some pressure on the UFC, because you know every single MMA journalist, I'll just say it like this, Ariel Helwani is having Jake Paul on his show within the next week to talk about this move with the PFL. You know that's going to happen. Like, there's a bitterness of the MMA media scene against the UFC and Dana White for justifiable reasons as well, a lot of the time, from the history and the way they've been treated. But the MMA media is a very anti-UFC thing. So if they get an opportunity to jump onto this whole PFL bandwagon and start talking about how they're making the UFC look bad and PFL pays more to fighters than the UFC, they're going to make those headlines all day long. So I think this could go well for PFL. I don't think they're ever going to take over the UFC, but I would like this move from Jake Paul to make the UFC just start acting right, man. Fuck the Apex, man. I'm looking at... Because I was thinking this, and Jake Paul, when he signed this deal, I was like, let me look at what the UFC have got coming up. Las Vegas, Imavov Gastelum, and the Jeff Neal Shavkat Rakhmonov fight is cancelled. Teixeira versus Hill is like a gimmicky title fight, innit? Jamal Hill is like number 7 in the light heavyweight division, and that card don't have much else on it either. Like, I feel like we're not really back into the UFC until UFC 284, Makhachev versus Volkanovski. I thought they were going to come back with a bang, but until February 11th, with Makhachev versus Volkanovski, and then Vera versus Sandhagen on February the 18th, it feels like we ain't really got no blockbuster cards to come back to. And I thought that after the 4 weeks off, they were going to come back with a bang, but they aren't. So maybe they'll buck their ideas up. Maybe this move by Jake Paul going to the PFL will make him a little bit more open to pay a guy like Paulo Costa a little bit more money. But at the end of the day, do I think PFL is ever going to be a threat to take over the UFC? No, but it might make them start trying a little bit more and raise their competitive spirit in the UFC offices to try and go above and beyond. Because at the moment, over the past few years, it feels like they've been doing the bare minimum. But Conor McGregor is the X factor here as well that could save 2023 in the UFC. Because if Conor McGregor comes back and wins and has 2 fights in 2023, that's 2 $1.5 million pay-per-view sale cards at least. You can put a bunch of your stars on the undercard of those cards as well, and they'll get a bunch of popularity from it. The card before and after the McGregor card are going to get a bunch of attention because all of the casual fan base are going to be, you know, actively digesting UFC content, and they're more likely to watch the fight night card before the big Conor McGregor pay-per-view and the fight night card afterwards. So McGregor being in the sport is going to make it what it is, so I'm really looking forward to McGregor coming back. But credit to Jake Paul making moves, man. You got to respect it. Jake Paul's a young guy. I think he's like 25, 26 maybe. And he's making some big moves. He's looking to fight Nate Diaz. People are still going to have a problem with this because they're going to say you're still ducking real boxers and stuff like this. But the guy's making business moves. And the Instagram post that he has 9 hours ago has nearly 250,000 likes. 224,000 likes. So he's looking to take on Nate Diaz in a boxing match under the PFL banner, but in a boxing ring, which is new for PFL, I believe. And then he's looking to take him on in MMA afterwards. We'll see how it goes. Will Nate Diaz accept? I reckon PFL's willing to fork out many millions to get Nate Diaz to accept to that, because they're getting Nate Diaz for 2 fights. And if they treat him well, Nate Diaz might look to continue doing fights in PFL afterwards, or Jake Paul might continue to work with PFL afterwards as well. So this is a big deal. This is a big deal. Looking forward to it. He's putting pressure on the UFC, and we'll see where it goes. We will see where it goes. But I know for a fact Ariel Helwani is going to have him on his show to talk about the PFL deal. There's going to be a bunch of MMA. My beanie's a little bit off-center here. Sorry if that bothered you. There's going to be a bunch of MMA media members desperate to reach out to Jake Paul and get him on their show to talk about this whole situation. So looking forward to it, man. Really looking forward to it. And I've seen a lot of UFC fighters like, oh shit, like a lot of people that have been cut from the UFC recently, a lot of people that maybe are coming to the end of their contract that are starting to think 50-50. I'll take that for the money. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, these fighters don't really care if the UFC is going to be around in a decade. They care how much money they're going to have in a decade's time. You know what I mean? So they're going to think about their own pockets rather than loyalty to the company of the UFC. Do I think the UFC will ever be challenged as the top spot? No. But they'll be taking some L's. And Dana White and his whole situation going on at the moment, not a good look for them. You know what I mean? And then they've got this sort of sham of a light heavyweight division situation playing out right now as well. And people talking about robbery this card, robbery that card. And there's a lot of bad press on the UFC recently. You know what I mean? And if Adesanya loses and continues to lose, what if Adesanya's contract runs out and he tries out PFL? You know what I mean? Because he ain't champing the UFC anymore. And the stars ain't winning in the UFC. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but we got... Makashev's a big name because he does get a lot of clicks and followers, but we've got Figueiredo, not really a big name. Aljamain Sterling, you know what I mean? Alexander Volkanovski, you know what I mean? As a personality, let's be real. Much rather for the UFC to have Holloway as a champion in the featherweight division to sell those pay-per-view buys. And we got Leon Edwards, who although did the impossible and it was a massive moment, he's not a 1 million follower champion in the UFC, and Pereira don't speak English, and the whole mess in the light heavyweight division right now, and Ngannou fights once a year, and he's having contract negotiation issues with the UFC, so I like it. I like the competition. We'll see what Jake Paul decides to do. But yeah, I like this. I like this. I don't see how they can possibly be making money. Because I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but ONE FC... First of all, let me talk about Jake Paul, Nate Diaz, sorry. But let me talk about ONE FC. ONE FC losses. Like, if you look at this, One Championship reports record high $110 million in losses for 2021. They lost $48 million less in 2020. And in 2021, they lost $110 million. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. They're just losing money. Like playing the game of, how much are we going to lose before we start to gain? You know what I mean? And I think PFL's playing that same game because at the end of the day, Jake Paul included or not, PFL posted this video on their YouTube page. I'll try and find it right now. That's where I actually first saw it, weirdly, because I was recommended PFL before I was recommended Jake Paul. But it's on their YouTube page 9 hours ago. Jake Paul signs the most disruptive deal in MMA history with the PFL. 17k views. It's problems, you know what I mean, with marketing themselves. And if I think it's Channel 4 in the UK. If you type in PFL, there's a channel called Channel 4 in the UK that they have a deal with, which is their equivalent of BT Sport. And The live MMA PFL World Championship Finals was on Channel 4's YouTube, and it got 33,000 views. I was watching it live on there, and it literally had hundreds of viewers, like 300 viewers, 10 people in the chat. I was in the chat, talking to people in the chat, while Brendan Loughnane was fighting and stuff like that. Like, they're going to have to make some more progressive steps, but I like this more than I like anything Bellator's doing, because it feels like for a while Bellator has literally been paid to lose in competition to the UFC, because they don't do anything interesting, really. Their crossover with Ryzen was pretty cool, but other than that, Bellator ain't a competition, so maybe PFL will take up that opportunity. And in terms of the Jake Paul-Nate Diaz fight, I reckon Jake Paul beats him in boxing, of course, not MMA. I don't think he beats him in MMA, but he does have a wrestling background. Maybe enough to stuff some takedowns. You know what I mean? And he's bought himself some time, because he's going to fight, if all goes to plan, he's fighting in boxing first. And then he's going to wait like 6 months later, probably 7 months, 8 months later, at the end of the year, to fight Nate Diaz in MMA. So the way he structured it is to buy himself time to try and learn some of the basics of MMA and get to grips with it, because at the end of the day, he is bigger than Nate Diaz. He does have a wrestling background, so maybe with the strength advantage and the wrestling background as well, maybe he could stuff some takedowns because he's so much bigger than him, and maybe then Nate Diaz could be in trouble. But I do believe Nate Diaz would win 100% in a MMA fight, because, you know, he could just latch up the arm of Jake Paul in the clinch after taking a big punch and pull guard and wrap up one of his legs. And, you know, shooting a double leg ain't the only way to get someone to the ground. But heaven forbid we see Nate Diaz pull a Ryan Hall and roll around on the ground like a fucking spaz for 3 rounds, desperately trying to get Jake to jump into his guard. But either way, like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Thought I'd give my thoughts on the whole Jake Paul situation. And, yeah, good. Good. This is good. Hopefully the UFC bucks their fucking ideas up, because Lewis versus Spivak, again, I'm going to mention this. The Nasruddin Imavov Kelvin Gastelum card, I'll watch it, but it's not good. It's not a good card, is it? Like, it's not like, oh my god, a big comeback for the UFC. The main event ain't all that good. You know what I mean? And the next best fight on that card is Dan Ige versus Damon Jackson. You know what I'm saying? Like, I thought we'd come back with a bit more heat than this, since we lost Jeff Neal versus Shavkat Rakhmonov. And then we've got Lewis versus Spivak. February 4th. 4 weeks away. It's got Lewis Spivak on the card. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 other fights on the card. It's an 8-fight fight night card. That's 5 on the main card, 3 on the prelims. 4 weeks away. The next best fight on that card is Marcin Tybura Blagoy-Ivanov. So, maybe this will give them the competitive spirit they need to start putting on some better fucking events. Like and subscribe. Toodle pip. See you later. Goodbye.